Hello and welcome to the Santee Church of Christ Bible Study Rewind, where we look at the previous class where we just go over the highlights of what we talked about in our studies. Currently we are in the book of Deuteronomy and we are in chapter 14. We broke into chapter 14 in the previous week and just kind of got through that very first verses 1 and 2, and still got into more in verses 1 and 2. We'll get through most of the chapter, maybe all. We're going to probably read all of it, but we don't cover all of it yet as far as all the subjects. But we'll get to most of it today. Now, Deuteronomy is a book written to the Israelites. It is dictated to Moses, or just should say Moses writes it to the people to remind them of their covenant with God, the laws that they are to obey, and what God expects from them when they get into this new land. Chapter 12 is a main division where God kind of stops talking about their history so much and just gets right into, here's what I want you to do right away. Get rid of all of the idols and establish a place to worship. So by the time we get to chapter 14, he says this in the first two verses. He says, "You are sons to Jehovah your God," which is by itself an astronomical thing to think about, that God is reaching out to a people and saying, "You're my children. You shall not cut yourselves nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead," which was something that was done by a lot of pagans. We talked about that the week before. "For you are a holy, you are a holy people to Jehovah your God. And Jehovah has chosen you to be a people to him, a special treasure out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." And the second question, well, the first question was, what is Israel described as in verse 1? What does this mean and why is that important? We talked about that. And then the second question, because of Israel's status, being called sons of God, what are they supposed to be? And compare that with 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10. And if you look at that verse, that is actually the New Testament application, where Peter talks about the Christian being separated out by God, high priests of God, and that sort of thing, and really brings home the same sort of wording that God is making here. You are a holy people, and Jehovah has chosen them to be a people to him. And of course that means they are to represent him. A special treasure out of all the peoples. God is saying, you're a special treasure to me. That's an important thing to think about. This is God making a statement. Whenever God makes the statement, it's a big deal. It's never something trite. In 1 Peter, Peter says, "But you are God's chosen special people," speaking to the Christian population. "You are a group of royal priests and a holy nation. God has brought you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now you must tell all the wonderful things that he has done." The scriptures say, "Once you were nobody, but now you are God's people. At one time, no one had pity on you," speaking of the Gentile and the Christian of that day. "Now God has treated you with kindness." The implication of verse 2 is that they were to act and become holy, separated out from all the other people. Peter clarifies it much later, and in Deuteronomy, God has been revealing what it should be looking like all along. Loving him, obeying him, and loving the humble in the land, the people who could not take care of themselves. This is something that God was making sure his people would do. That word holy just means sacred, clean, and out of the people, implies you're separated from everybody else. Don't look like them. And that was God's big deal with them, is don't look like everybody else. They're doing idolatrous things. You do not do that. That is the big deal in this book. So what is one way holiness would look like in the life of Israel? And the writer of the question says, notice how this section begins and ends in verse 2 and 21. The very food choices they made were to be clean. This is my answer. They were to be clean as dictated by God because they are holy. The word holy simply means sacred and clean. It implied a consecration and signifies a separation as it is stated in verse 2. So verse 2 says, a special treasure out of all the peoples. In verse 21, you are a holy people to God, to Jehovah your God. Okay, so I'm going to read through this because this is basically God telling them what they can eat and how a holy people will look simply by the things that they eat. You shall not eat any abominable thing. These are the animals which you shall eat: the ox, the flock sheep, and the flocked goat, the hart and gazelle and roe deer and wild goat and antelope and oryx and mouflon. And you shall eat every animal that divides the hoof and divides two hoofs wholly, and choose the cud among the animals, like sheep and cows and that sort of thing. But you shall not eat of those that only chew the cud, or those only dividing the cloven hoof, like the cow, or the camel, like the pig, or the camel, the hare and the rock badger, for they chew the cud but do not divide the hoof. They shall be unclean for you. And the swine, because it divides the hoof but does not chew the cud, it is unclean to you. And you shall not eat of their flesh, nor touch their dead body. These you shall eat of all in the waters. You shall eat all that have fins and scales. Pretty simple. And whatever does not have fins and scales you shall not eat. It shall be unclean to you. You shall eat of all clean birds. You shall not eat of these: the eagle, the black vulture, the bearded vulture, the hawk, falcons, kites, ravens, ostrich, owls, the great seagull, small hawks, the little owl, the eared owl, the barn owl, the pelican, the owl, and the cormorant, the stork, and the heron after its kind, and the hoopoe, which I don't even know what that is, and the bat. Don't eat bats. And every teeming thing that flies shall be unclean to you. They shall not be eaten. You may eat of all clean birds. So there's a distinction between birds that some, especially raptors, if you look at that list, birds of prey are not to be eaten. But some are okay. Specifically ones that don't fly, like chickens. They fly, but they're not like regular flight birds where they can fly a long way. You shall not eat anything that died of itself. You may give it to the alien who is within your gates, that he may eat of it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you are a holy people to Jehovah your God. So they're speaking specifically of roadkill, right? Something that died, you just found it and it was dead. It needed to be something that was killed ritualistically. And he talks about that later, or previously in another book. The point is, don't eat roadkill. and then he says something very interesting at the very last part of this section, and it says, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And we really had a very in-depth discussion on it, and I promised that I would try and look into it a little bit more, because it just seems like a weird thing to say at this very juncture in time. It almost, in my mind, seems to be out of place. And I think when we look at it, I think I really am believing that it's kind of out of place. as far as where it's where it's placed in the verses itself, because there are two other instances where God tells the people not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. So we'll get into that. So the question is, what is another way they were to look holy? And that is basically what it is. You are to eat some things you are not to eat. So this was the whole thing where the Israelites were not to eat pork and all kinds of other things that, today we just eat without even a thought. Okay. What is another way that holiness would look in the life of Israel? And this was the last part that we covered, because we got into tithing. And of course we are, and I say this so much, we are not under this covenant. We are not compelled to tithe, but we are compelled to give. And we're going to get into those things. That's 22 through 29. Let me just read that. Tithing, you shall tithe. And I'm reading from the literal version. And that's really what it means. It says tithe. And the King James says truly tithe, because somebody brought that up. You shall tithe all the increase of your seed that the field yields year by year. And you shall eat before Jehovah in the place where he shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. The tithe of your grain, of your wine, your oil, the firstlings of your herd and of your flock, that you may learn to fear Jehovah your God all your days. And if the way is too long for you, so that you cannot carry it, because the place is too far from which Jehovah your God shall choose to set his name there, then Jehovah your God shall bless you. Then you shall give it for silver, and bind up the silver in your hand, and you shall go to the place which Jehovah your God shall choose. So in other words, if there's too much to bring, you can sell it, bring the silver, and then go to the place where you are to eat it before God and buy something there. And you shall pay the silver for whatever your soul desires, for oxen, sheep, wine, or fermented drink, or whatever your soul desires. And you shall eat there before Jehovah your God. And you shall rejoice, you and your household, and you shall not forsake the Levite. By the way, remember the Levite, who is within your gates, for he has no portion nor inheritance with you. And at the end of 3 years, even the same year of that third year, you shall bring forth all the tithe of your increase and lay it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion, no inheritance with you, and the alien, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, so that Jehovah your God may bless you and all the work of your hand which you can do. So there he is, providing for the Levite that did not receive a land inheritance. And poor people within the community who didn't have the same means to get food and that sort of thing. So poor people were taken care of. And we're going to see other ways that God's taking care of people in the community, the poor and the less fortunate. So tithing, well, the 10% of the year's increase 2 times a year in these yearly tithing ceremonies. They were supposed to do that. And then in that third year, they were to tithe yet again. And this is just God making sure that they learn to appreciate who he is. You know, the wording here says, fear him. Yes, fear him, revere him, hold him up where he belongs, and understand that everything comes from him. And you do that twice a year, and then once every 3 years. And there are other things that we're going to be going over that they practice to help one another in their own communities. So those were the 3 main things that we brought up that they were to do in this new land in order to represent God. And that is what this whole thing is about. It's about representing God, much like what the Christian does today through Jesus the Christ. So here are some of the other notes that people brought up. Somebody brought up the royal priesthood that Peter was talking about. and remember that God has shown mercy on us. And this is something that we do at the Churches of Christ. We partake of the Lord's Supper every week so that we can examine ourselves to, while we're all together, to remember our place before God and who God is and what he did for us, that he sent his son to die for us. We don't wait till Christmas to do anything like that. We do that every week because it is so meaningful and important to us. This other thing about cutting and shaving, and we talked about that, was a pagan thing, and God did not want them to look like the idolatrous people in the nations, and we did talk about that again. And that's an important thing for the Christian as well. If we're living our lives like everybody else, if we're cursing and being evil and stealing and stuff, how is anybody going to know that we're even a Christian? How are they going to know that maybe we know the Word of God? So the Christian is compelled to be obedient to the Word, and it's not that difficult when you really look at the Word. When Paul explains the fruit of the Spirit and what the life of a Christian looks like, it's really not that complicated. Somebody brought up Ephesians 1, which speaks to how we are to look once we become enlightened of the gospel. It is our actions that gives God the opportunity to practice his justice and mercy with us, and because it reveals our faith, and as God has directed through his apostles, and through the Old Testament writing, that it is our faith through which God will find us righteous, and we manifest our faith by our obedience. If we're not obedient to God, then we are not manifesting ourselves before man and before God. And that is what God expects. That's not me saying it. That's the scriptures. And a lot of people want to twist that around, but that's the reality of it. Somebody brought up this part about the boiling the kid in the mother's milk. In other words, if you have a goat, don't boil it in its mother's milk. Because, okay, I'm going to go over all the different things that people say about it, not only in our class, but in other places that you'll find other scholars and other people. One is what is considered the low-hanging fruit, that was a practice of the pagans. And I looked it up. I'm not a scholar. I looked up as much as I could, but I couldn't find evidence of that being the truth. We just assume that that's what it means. So, if somebody can find a historical writing or something where, people would boil like the offering of a young lamb or a young goat in its own mother's milk, I can understand how that might seem detestable, that this is, the mother's milk is what is supposed to be giving it life, and here it's like an abomination. That was another reasoning behind it, that it was just found to be very undesirable and an unseemly thing to do for your sacrifice, and I can see that. But as I did my in-depth study, and I was going to some sites that were explaining the Jewish and Hebrew language, the same word that is used for boiling is also used for ripen. So in other words, you could say, don't boil this kid in its mother's milk, or it could be saying, don't offer an animal that has matured through its mother's. In other words, its mother has brought it to maturity. You've waited too long. And the other point was brought up in class, and I think this is probably closer to the reality of this saying than these other first two things that I talked about. And that there's an idiom that talks about not mixing the old with the new. In other words, these offerings were to be fresh on the person, on behalf of whoever was offering it. You got a certain amount during these months for the tithing. Don't use something old and present it to God. You take that first fruits. That's why they call it the first fruits offerings. And that's what this covers, is the first fruits offerings. And in this section, it seems to be talking about the eating of different foods, but then immediately it talks about tithing. And the tithing had to do with whatever was coming in, whether, monthly or whatever. However you purpose to tithe, or however often they did their tithes, which was, like I said, 3 different times, but you would be storing these things up with an immediacy, with a purpose every week, much like we do today. And so I think that probably is a lot more logical for the context, which demands an explanation. Why would God talk about first fruits and then all of a sudden, and by the way, don't boil a kid in its milk? Well, it makes sense that he wants that certain frame of mind for the person who is doing this. So I kind of went over everybody's answer there. So it was basically an idiom, and Jesus kind of repeats this idiom in Matthew 9, where he talks about patching old clothes with new cloth, or putting new wine in old wineskins. You don't want to do those things, because if you put a new patch on an old piece of cloth, on an old cloth, it'll just pull away and make the tear worse. If you put new wine in old skins, it'll burst it, it'll break it. And so that idiom of keeping the new things new is probably, in my mind anyway, a lot more accurate than this boiling kids in milk, which I agree, that sounds like that might be considered abominable. Okay, so in the tithing sector, one other thing about tithing, we and they needed to remember what it means to be holy, and tithing was geared toward that, and they were to keep their tithing mindful. In the church, we talk a lot about purposing our gifts to God every week, but we'll talk about giving as well a little bit here more. In the tithing sector, we tithe what we purpose in our heart. That should apply to all that we receive throughout the year, not just once a week or something like that. And it's directed for us to remember that everything comes from God. And in the King James, the word truly tithe is in there, and that somebody brought up was this condition of the heart, that you are doing it with with earnest and with purpose, doing it honestly. Paul says God loves a cheerful giver. Yes, we feel compelled to give because God is such a wonderful God, but we don't feel like it's compulsion and we feel begrudging towards God. It's not that at all. Our giving needs to be cheerfully. That's where we need to be with it. So, Christians are not told to tithe. We're told to give what we can. We'll get into that in a second. Our giving is our responsibility. It is not the government. They may help the poor, but that does not absolve the Christian to practice compassion. Our hearts need to grow to love God and His creation all the time. And we can't rely on, we can't look at the government and say, well, the government's taking care of the poor people, so I don't need to worry about it. We are not absolved of compassion because the government does something. And the government is typically so terrible at those things that they don't take care of everything. Also, there are 3 tithes, 2 every year and 1 every 3 years. And so There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of giving throughout the years, and each time was at 10%. And then there was the taking care of the family and community, and there's taxes to the king when they actually start asking for kings. So, it wasn't just this one-time giving and they were done. This was something they were continually doing, and we're going to get into more of that, how God takes care of the community. And he really leaves it up to the neighbor to take care of neighbor and that sort of thing. And then one last comment was, and the Christian application is, give what you can. And sometimes we get into financial situations where we can't give money. And we have to remember that God doesn't need our money. That's a church thing. That's we want to pay for the air conditioning, or we want to print up some nice books so we can all work out of the same book. And that's good. Those are good things. But God doesn't need our money. And the giving that really counts is when we're not at the building. Trusting that God will take care of us no matter what we do. And much of our giving is of ourselves and of our time, and practicing love, and that allows us to give continually. The Christian is always looking to how, if we see a situation that we can help somebody, we help them. That's what the Christian does. And, sometimes we get all wrapped up in life and we don't do that so well because we're just all human. But that is the goal for every Christian. Okay, so that was what we covered. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, you can contact us through our main website page, our Facebook page, or our YouTube page, and the addresses will be after this. Thank you. May God continue to bless us always, and may God bless you. Thank you.